The icy water from the storm had soaked Rosalie Vance to the bone as she huddled beneath the stranger's porch, praying the torrential downpour would soon cease. The year was 1878, and the Dakota Territory was unforgiving to those who traveled alone, especially a woman with nothing but the clothes on her back and a small leather satchel containing her few remaining possessions. Preston Daniels noticed the peculiar shadow beneath his porch just as the sun began to set. With rifle in hand, he cautiously approached, expecting to find a coyote or perhaps a stray dog seeking shelter. Instead, he found a woman, trembling and pale, her chestnut hair plastered to her face by the relentless rain. "Madam," Preston called out, lowering his weapon. "You all right down there?" Rosalie startled at his voice, pressing herself further against the wooden slats as if hoping to disappear completely. Her eyes, wide with fear and exhaustion, met his. "I mean no harm," she said, her voice barely audible above the pounding rain. "I just needed. I'll be moving on shortly." Preston studied her for a moment. Her dress, though once fine, was muddied and torn at the hem. She wore no wedding band, and the way her shoulders hunched spoke of more than just physical weariness. "You'll catch your death out here," he said firmly. "Come inside. I've got a fire going." Rosalie hesitated, weighing her options. The man before her didn't look like the sort who'd take advantage. His eyes were kind beneath the brim of his weather-beaten hat, and he'd already lowered his weapon. Still, she'd learned the hard way that appearances could be deceiving. "I can't pay you," she admitted. "Wasn't asking for payment," Preston replied, extending his hand. "Just offering shelter from the storm." After another moment's hesitation, Rosalie accepted his outstretched hand and allowed him to help her to her feet. Her legs nearly buckled beneath her, and Preston instinctively caught her by the elbow to steady her. "How long have you been under there?" he asked, concern etching his weathered face. "Since midday," she admitted, refusing to meet his eyes. Preston led her up the steps to his modest cabin. It wasn't much, a single room with a bed in one corner, a small table with 2 chairs, and a pot-bellied stove that cast a warm glow over the rough-hewn walls. A saddle rested on a stand near the door, and various tools hung from pegs driven into the logs. "It ain't much," Preston said, suddenly aware of how sparse his dwelling must appear to a stranger. "But it's dry." Rosalie stood awkwardly just inside the door, water pooling around her boots on the wooden floor. Her teeth chattered uncontrollably as she hugged herself for warmth. "You need to get out of those wet clothes," Preston said matter-of-factly, then immediately flushed when he realized how his words might be interpreted. "I mean, I've got a spare shirt and some trousers that might fit you well enough for tonight. You can change behind that screen there while I fix something warm to eat." He gestured toward a wooden folding screen in the corner that provided minimal privacy for washing up. Then he busied himself with stoking the fire and adding another log, giving her a moment to consider his offer. Rosalie nodded gratefully and accepted the dry clothes. He handed her a faded flannel shirt and a pair of trousers that had seen better days. "Thank you, Mr. Daniels." "Preston Daniels," he supplied, tipping his hat slightly. "And you are?" "Rosalie." "Rosalie Vance," she replied softly. While Rosalie changed behind the screen, Preston set about warming a pot of beans and bacon he'd cooked that morning. He could hear the rustle of fabric as she struggled to remove her sodden garments, and he kept his eyes fixed firmly on the task at hand, determined to preserve her dignity. When she emerged from behind the screen, she looked like a different woman. Preston's clothes engulfed her slender frame, the sleeves rolled up several times to free her hands, the trousers cinched tight at the waist with a length of rope. But her face had more color now, and she'd managed to wring out her hair so it hung in damp waves past her shoulders. "Feel better?" Preston asked, pouring coffee into a tin mug. "Much, thank you." Rosalie accepted the steaming cup gratefully, wrapping her fingers around it to warm them. They ate in relative silence, the storm punctuating their few exchanges with thunderous claps and the persistent drumming of rain on the roof. Rosalie ate ravenously, though she tried to maintain some semblance of decorum, and Preston pretended not to notice when she sopped up the last of the bean juices with a hunk of cornbread. As night fell in earnest, an awkward tension descended upon the cabin. Preston cleared his throat. "You can take the bed," he said, nodding toward the narrow cot in the corner. "I'll make do on the floor." Rosalie's brow furrowed. "I couldn't possibly." "You can and you will," Preston insisted. "No argument. You've been through enough today, whatever it was. The floor and I are old friends." Before she could protest further, Preston gathered several blankets from a trunk and fashioned a makeshift pallet near the stove. The arrangement was far from comfortable, but he'd slept in worse conditions during his years as a ranch hand and later as a Texas Ranger before settling in Dakota Territory. "Mr. Daniels," Rosalie began hesitantly as she perched on the edge of the bed. "Preston," he corrected. "Preston," she amended. "I want you to know I'm not in the habit of imposing on strangers. Tomorrow I'll be on my way and—" "Where you headed?" he interrupted, spreading a blanket on his pallet. The question caught her off guard. I don't exactly know. West, I suppose. Somewhere new." Preston nodded thoughtfully but didn't press the matter. "Well, no sense making plans in this weather. We'll figure it out come morning." Rosalie slipped beneath the woolen blanket on Preston's bed, the exhaustion of the day finally overtaking her. The last thing she remembered before drifting off was the sight of Preston stoking the fire one last time, his profile strong against the dancing flames. When she woke the following morning, the storm had passed, leaving behind a brilliant blue sky visible through the cabin's single window. For a disorienting moment, Rosalie couldn't remember where she was. Then the events of the previous day came flooding back, and she sat up abruptly. Preston was already awake, his pallet neatly folded and stowed. He stood at the stove, frying salt pork in a cast-iron skillet. The aroma made Rosalie's stomach growl audibly. "Morning," Preston said without turning around. "Hope you like your coffee strong." "Strong is fine," Rosalie replied, smoothing her hair self-consciously. She was acutely aware of her disheveled appearance and the fact that she was still wearing his clothes. Preston served up a simple but hearty breakfast of salt pork, fried potatoes, and the last of the cornbread. As they ate, Rosalie finally mustered the courage to explain her situation. "I was working as a schoolteacher in Bismarck," she began, pushing a potato around her plate. "The school board president's son took an interest in me. When I declined his attentions, he became vindictive, started spreading rumors." Preston listened intently, his expression neutral. "Before long, my reputation was in tatters. No one would believe my side of the story." She swallowed hard. "When they dismissed me, I decided to leave. Start fresh somewhere people don't know me." "That's a hard road for a woman alone," Preston observed. "I'm aware," Rosalie replied with a hint of defiance. "But I'd rather face the unknown than stay where I'm not wanted." Preston nodded, respecting her resolve. After a moment's consideration, he made an offer that surprised even himself. "My nearest neighbor's a good 10 miles away, and the town's another 5 beyond that. If you're not in a hurry, I could use some help around here for a spell. The pay wouldn't be much, but you'd have a roof and meals." Rosalie eyed him suspiciously. "What kind of help?" "Nothing untoward," Preston assured her quickly. "My sister usually comes out for a few weeks in the spring to help with the planting and mending, but she's expecting her 3rd child and can't make the journey this year. I've fallen behind." The proposition was unexpected but not unwelcome. Rosalie knew her meager savings wouldn't last long, and the prospect of secure lodging while she planned her next move was tempting. I don't know the first thing about ranching, she admitted. Preston smiled, the expression transforming his usually solemn face. You can read and figure, can't you? That's more than most in these parts. I need help organizing my accounts and writing letters to suppliers. And if you can sew a straight seam, that'd be worth your weight in gold. I've more holes in my clothes than fabric at this point. After careful consideration, Rosalie agreed to stay for 2 weeks. It would give her time to dry out, earn a little money, and decide where to go next. Neither of them suspected that those 2 weeks would stretch into a month, and then 2, as spring blossomed across the prairie. Rosalie proved herself invaluable around the ranch. Her orderly mind brought Preston's chaotic record keeping into line, revealing that he was in better financial shape than he'd realized. She took over the correspondence with cattle buyers and supply houses, her elegant penmanship and proper grammar lending his business an air of sophistication it had previously lacked. For his part, Preston taught Rosalie about ranch life, how to identify the signs of an approaching storm, which wild plants were edible, and even how to handle his old revolver in case of emergency. They fell into an easy rhythm, working side by side during the day and sharing quiet evenings by the fire. One evening in late May, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the prairie in shades of gold and crimson, Preston finally asked the question that had been on his mind for weeks. Why haven't you moved on yet? Rosalie tensed slightly. It was true her 2-week arrangement had extended well beyond its original time frame, and neither of them had mentioned it. I suppose I've been waiting for a sign, she said after a thoughtful pause. Something to tell me where I should go next. Preston nodded, his eyes fixed on the horizon. And if there isn't one? There always is, Rosalie insisted. Sometimes it's just harder to recognize. The following day, that sign appeared in the form of a letter delivered by the monthly mail carrier. It was addressed to Rosalie, forwarded from the school in Bismarck. With trembling hands, she broke the seal and read its contents, her expression growing more distressed with each line. Bad news? Preston asked when she finally set the letter down. The worst kind, Rosalie replied, her voice hollow. Edward Blackwood, the school board president's son, is claiming I stole money from the school fund before I left. It's a lie, of course, but they're threatening legal action if I don't return. Preston's jaw tightened. You can't go back there. I have to clear my name, Rosalie insisted. If I don't, this will follow me wherever I go. That evening, they formulated a plan. Preston would accompany Rosalie to Bismarck to confront her accusers and clear her name. The timing wasn't ideal. The summer heat had arrived early, and Preston had cattle to move to higher pastures, but he wouldn't let her face this alone. They set out 2 days later, leaving the ranch in the care of a neighboring rancher's son. The journey to Bismarck would take nearly a week by wagon, following the winding path of the Missouri River northward. The trip brought them closer than ever. Camping beneath the stars, they shared stories of their pasts. Preston's years as a Texas Ranger before a bullet in his shoulder forced him to find a quieter life, and Rosalie's childhood in Pennsylvania before her parents' deaths left her to make her own way in the world. On the third night, as they sat beside their small campfire, Preston found himself studying Rosalie's profile in the flickering light. The woman he'd found huddled beneath his porch months ago bore little resemblance to the confident, capable person before him now. Her skin had taken on a healthy glow from working outdoors, and her hands, once soft from indoor work, now showed the calluses of ranch life. What is it? Rosalie asked, catching him staring. Just thinking how different you look from that first night, Preston admitted. Rosalie smiled. Is that good or bad? Good, he said without hesitation. Real good. Their eyes held for a moment longer than necessary, and for the first time, Preston allowed himself to acknowledge the feelings that had been growing within him. But this wasn't the time, not with the uncertainty of what awaited them in Bismarck looming ahead. They arrived in the bustling river town a few days later, securing rooms at a modest hotel near the courthouse. Preston insisted on separate accommodations to protect Rosalie's reputation, though the proprietress assumed they were married and gave them adjoining rooms with a knowing smile. The following morning, they made their way to the school where Rosalie had taught. The current schoolmistress, a pinched-faced woman named Miss Olmsted, regarded Rosalie with thinly veiled contempt. "Mr. Blackwood isn't here today," she informed them coldly. "But I'm sure the sheriff would be interested to know you've returned." "The sheriff already knows," Preston interjected, his hand resting casually near his holstered revolver. "We visited him first thing this morning." Interesting fellow seemed quite surprised to hear about these theft allegations, seeing as no official report was ever filed. Miss Olmsted's expression faltered. "Well, I'm sure Mr. Blackwood had his reasons." "I'm sure he did," Rosalie agreed, her voice steady, "and I intend to discuss those reasons with him directly. Please let him know I'll be at the hotel if he wishes to speak with me before we visit Judge Wilson tomorrow." The mention of the judge, a fair-minded man known for his distaste for false accusations, had the desired effect. Miss Olmsted promised to relay the message, though her tight-lipped expression suggested she wasn't pleased about it. That evening, Edward Blackwood himself appeared at their hotel, his usual arrogance somewhat diminished by the presence of Preston, whose reputation as a former Texas Ranger had apparently preceded him. "Miss Vance," Blackwood began stiffly, "I understand you've returned to address certain financial discrepancies." "There are no discrepancies, Mr. Blackwood," Rosalie replied calmly. "Only false accusations made by a man whose advances I rejected." Blackwood's face flushed. "That's preposterous. The money is exactly where it always was," Rosalie interrupted, producing a ledger from her satchel. "In the school fund, properly accounted for by my own hand. What's missing are the donation records from the spring social records that were in your possession when I left." Preston watched the exchange with quiet admiration. The schoolteacher he'd sheltered months ago had become a formidable adversary, armed with facts and unshakable in her resolve. Blackwood's bluster faded as Rosalie methodically dismantled his accusations, pointing out discrepancies in his story and presenting letters from parents who had witnessed his inappropriate behavior toward her. "What do you want?" he finally asked, defeat evident in his slumped shoulders. "A written retraction of your accusations and an apology," Rosalie stated firmly, "both to be printed in the town newspaper at your expense." Blackwood glanced at Preston, who had remained silent throughout the exchange, but whose steady gaze conveyed a clear message. After a moment's consideration, Blackwood nodded reluctantly. "And then you'll leave Bismarck for good?" "I already have," Rosalie replied simply. The following day, Blackwood signed the retraction in the presence of Judge Wilson, who made no effort to hide his disapproval of the young man's actions. By afternoon, the matter was officially resolved, and Rosalie felt the weight of months of anxiety finally lift from her shoulders. As they prepared to leave Bismarck the next morning, Preston broached the subject they'd both been avoiding. "What now?" he asked as they loaded their wagon. "You've cleared your name. You could stay here if you wanted, or go anywhere else." Rosalie secured the last of their supplies before turning to face him. "What would you have me do?" Preston removed his hat, turning it nervously in his hands. "I'd have you come back with me, if that's what you want." "As your housekeeper?" Rosalie asked, her expression unreadable. "No," Preston said firmly. "Not as my housekeeper." The trip back to the ranch seemed both shorter and longer than their journey to Bismarck. Shorter because they traveled with lighter hearts, stopping to admire the wildflowers that carpeted the prairie or to swim in a cool stream when the midday heat became too intense. Longer because of the tension that now hummed between them, not unpleasant, but charged with possibility. They spoke of practical matters, the cattle that needed moving, the garden that needed tending, the roof that needed patching before fall. But beneath these conversations ran a current of deeper meaning, of plans that extended beyond the immediate future. One evening, as they made camp beside a small creek, Preston finally gathered his courage. He'd been carrying his mother's ring in his saddlebag since they left Bismarck, waiting for the right moment. "Rosalie," he began, sitting beside her on a fallen log. "I'm not much for fancy words or grand gestures. Never had cause to learn them." She turned to him, her eyes reflecting the golden light of the setting sun. "I've never needed either." "Good," Preston said with a nervous smile. "Because all I can offer is what you've already seen: a small ranch, hard work, and a man who never thought he'd find someone he couldn't imagine living without." Rosalie's breath caught. "Preston." He took her hand in his calloused one. "I know it hasn't been long, not by most folks' reckoning. And if you need more time, I understand. But I want you to know that wherever you decide to go next, I'd like to go there with you. Or if you want to stay at the ranch, I'd like that too. What I'm trying to say, not very well, is that I love you, Rosalie Vance." Tears welled in Rosalie's eyes. "I love you too, and I don't need more time. I knew weeks ago that I'd found where I belong." Preston pulled the small gold ring from his pocket, a simple band with a tiny pearl that had been his mother's. "Then would you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" "Yes," Rosalie answered without hesitation. "Yes, I will." They were married 2 weeks after returning to the ranch, in a simple ceremony at the small church in town. The minister's wife served as witness, along with the shopkeeper and his family who had come to know the couple through their monthly visits for supplies. Life as newlyweds on the frontier presented its challenges. Their first year together brought a drought that threatened the cattle, a barn fire started by lightning that destroyed half their hay stores, and a brief but frightening encounter with a group of rustlers that reminded Rosalie why Preston always kept his revolver within reach. But these hardships were balanced by moments of profound joy: the completion of the addition to their cabin that gave them a proper bedroom and sitting area, the arrival of a fine Arabian mare that Preston surprised Rosalie with on her birthday, the quiet evenings spent reading aloud from the growing collection of books they ordered from back east. By their second anniversary, the ranch had prospered enough that they could hire occasional help, giving them more time together. It was during one such period of relative leisure that Rosalie shared the news she'd suspected for several weeks: they would be welcoming a child come spring. Preston's reaction was everything Rosalie had hoped for. His usual reserved demeanor gave way to unabashed joy as he lifted her off her feet and spun her around, mindful of her condition but unable to contain his excitement. The winter of 1881 was particularly harsh, with blizzards that isolated the ranch for weeks at a time. But within their snug cabin, Preston and Rosalie created their own warmth. He carved a cradle from oak while she sewed tiny garments, both of them marveling at how their lives had changed since that stormy evening when fate had brought them together. Emma Grace Daniels arrived on a clear April morning in 1882, with the assistance of a midwife who had ridden through the night to reach them. She had her father's eyes and her mother's determined spirit, evident from her first lusty cries. As Preston held his daughter for the first time, he reflected on the strange and wonderful path that had led to this moment. If not for that spring storm 3 years earlier, if Rosalie had sought shelter elsewhere, if he hadn't noticed the shadow beneath his porch, their lives would have taken entirely different courses. "What are you thinking about?" Rosalie asked from the bed, exhausted but radiant. "About rain," Preston replied with a smile, "and how sometimes the things that seem like hardships turn out to be the greatest blessings." 5 years later, the Daniels Ranch had grown considerably. What had once been a modest operation now employed several hands and was known throughout the territory for its quality stock. The cabin had been expanded again to accommodate their growing family. Emma Grace had been joined by a brother, William, and Rosalie was expecting their third child. On the anniversary of the day they met, Preston and Rosalie made it a tradition to sit on their porch regardless of the weather, remembering the storm that had brought them together. Sometimes they reminisced about those early days, Rosalie's first awkward attempts at ranch work, Preston's surprise when he discovered she could outshoot him with his own revolver, the gradual transformation of his bachelor cabin into a proper home. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if it hadn't rained that day?" Rosalie asked as they watched their children playing in the yard. Preston considered the question, his arm draped comfortably around his wife's shoulders. "I reckon some things are just meant to be, rain or shine, but I'm mighty glad it poured." Rosalie leaned her head against his shoulder, her hand resting on her growing belly. "So am I." As the sun set over the Dakota Prairie, casting long shadows across the land they had cultivated together, Preston and Rosalie Daniels contemplated the future stretching before them, a future built on a foundation of chance, choice, and the courage to offer shelter from the storm.